Well, hello, this is Tim Ingold here from the University of Aberdeen, and I bring you greetings from everybody here in our Department of Anthropology. And it's a great honour for me to be participating in this symposium in honour of our great friend and colleague, Hugh Beach. And I'm only sorry that I'm unable to be here with you in person, but I'm here anyway in spirit. I have a talk here called On the Expression of Difference in the Language of Similarity, and if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read it out. Everyone is different, but are some more different than others? Can we say that people here have more in common with one another than any of them do with those people there? This, after all, is how we have always been taught to sort people out into cultures or subcultures. The members of a culture, we're inclined to say, have a lot in common. Usually they speak the same language, they may profess to the same lifestyle, follow the same religious observances, subscribe to the same values, and so on. It might even be said that thanks to these commonalities, they inhabit their own cultural world, just one of a multitude of such worlds which, taken together, make up the universe of humanity. We anthropologists have long been at the forefront in making the case for cultural diversity. Indeed, we sometimes seem constitutionally averse to singularity. Never one world, we insist, always many worlds. But to my mind, however, this appeal to plurality is misguided. It's not only wrong in principle, it's also perilous for the discipline, leaving us powerless to oppose those hegemonic constructions of the global predicament, more often than not bolstered by big science and data analytics, that have delivered mass inequality, disenfranchisement, and deprivation. An anthropology worthy of the name must, in my view, be founded on the principle that we inhabit one world. The challenge, then, is not to speak for the many rather than the one, but to articulate with clarity and conviction a vision of the oneness of the world that is explicitly counter-hegemonic. And in order to do this, we need to think again about what we mean by having things in common. Exactly a century ago, in his treatise on democracy and education, the philosopher and pragmatist John Dewey drew our attention to the intrinsic connection between the words common, community, and communication. And this, he insisted, is not just an accident of etymology. It rather points to a fundamental condition for the possibility of social life. Men live in a community, wrote Dewey, in virtue of the things which they have in common, and communication is the way in which they come to possess things in common. And note this well, having things in common is not a prerequisite for communication, but its outcome, not what allows us to communicate, but what it achieves. We could perhaps follow Dewey's lead and at the same time revert to a medieval usage by turning common into a verb and communication into commoning. It's what people do in the participatory process of living together. Indeed, in her recent book on reclaiming the commons, the Canadian writer and activist Heather Menzies has spoken of commoning in just this sense, as a way of doing and organising things as implicated participants, immersed in the here and now of living habitat. Those are her words. Thus understood, commoning is not, of course, limited to human inhabitants, nor is it just about the world. Rather, as I shall show it, it is the world, a world of beings that, immersed in life, are continually answering and answerable to one another. To common, in this sense, is not to regress to a set of baseline attributes with which all participants are endowed to begin with. It rather entails an attentive stretch, whereby every participant casts their experience forward in ways that can answer to the experience of others, and they likewise, so as to achieve a concordance that goes beyond what any of them could have imagined at the outset, and that in turn allows them to carry on their lives together. Critically, there can be no commoning without difference. Only because participants differ in the experience they can bring can it be a living process that grows and develops over time. And conversely, there can be no difference without commoning. For it is in answering to others that each of us comes into our own as a person with a singular and recognizable voice. And this is particularly clear if we consider the way the movement of commoning carries on over generations. All life is social, as Dewey well knew, and for social life to continue, generations must overlap, and seniors and juniors, growing older together, must participate in a commoning that both feeds on difference and gives rise to it. Thus are children introduced to the ways of their parents and grandparents, along which they in turn will carry on, opening to new horizons as they go. And for this carrying on, Dewey used the term transmission. Now, the idea that culture is perpetuated through intergenerational transmission still commands general assent today. But the meaning of transmission is no longer what it was. For most contemporary theorists, it is equated not with a generative and open-ended process of carrying on, but with a mechanism of inheritance, the contents of which are predetermined. To speak of cultural knowledge as an inheritance is to liken it to a property that, far from emerging in the intercourse of generations, is both ready-made and available for transfer independently and in advance of its application in the world. Initially in the possession of seniors, it is supposed that knowledge is progressively released to juniors whose mental capacities are innately primed to receive it. Thus, the original difference between juniors and seniors is gradually erased as the former are topped up to the level of the latter, only for the process to be repeated in the next generation. But if that were so, if the only possible intergenerational difference were between degrees of inheritance, or between knowing more or less of a pre-existing repertoire, then social life itself would be stultified. Cut off from the very source of its nourishment, it would be stuck in a groove of ever-repeating cycles from which only accidental errors of transmission could offer hope of escape. Nor could anyone speak, save as a mouthpiece for their culture, in the service of which one voice is as good as another. Yet, notwithstanding their stultifying effect, the metaphors of transmission and inheritance have continued to exert a stranglehold on our thinking, not just in anthropology, but across the entire spectrum of the human sciences. Far from respecting difference, they cast it as varying degrees of ignorance, or of mistaken or irrational belief, vis-à-vis the omniscience of scientific reason, that would put a stop to the process of commoning and eradicate all difference, if only it had the power to do so. For reason, with its claim to universality, is indifferent to variations in the experience of those who speak in its name. Commoning and differentiation, then, are not opposed. They don't draw a line between us and them, or between one culture and another, but are two sides of the same coin. And that coin is social life. It is the voice of universal reason in the reduction of experience to the expression of heritable traits that has reduced the differentiations of social life to the diversity of transmitted culture. Differentiation is a process of becoming, but diversity compares the properties or attributes of things and persons as if they had already broken off from the processes that gave rise to them and were deposited as fragments upon a homogeneous and featureless ground. Thus are the fragments of culture, popularly known as memes, supposed to rest upon the universal substrate of human nature, common to all and pre-coded in the genetic capital of the species. And yet, how many times have we attempted to define human nature in the terms of the common possession of this or that attribute, bipedalism, tool-making, pair bonding, language, symbolic thought, and so on, only to discover that there are creatures born of man and woman who lack these attributes and who consequently find themselves excluded, or at least considered less than human. The one world we inhabit is not, however, reserved for what evolutionary psychologist Donald Brown has called universal people, creatures of the normative imagination delineated by a suite of innate capacities and behavioural traits that all are supposed to share. It is rather a world of ever-emergent difference, which admits no boundaries of inclusion or exclusion. In this world of becoming, though each of us may be different, these differences are constituted in and through the generative processes of life. They do not exist in spite of it. As differentiation is to diversity, so commoning is to homogeneity or sameness. And if anything divides, it is the language of similarity. For it is this language that cuts up the continuities of life into minimal constituents, otherwise known as individuals, which can then be held up for comparison in terms of heritable traits they may or may not have in common. Not difference, but sameness, in rendering identity as the condition of being identical, creates categorical boundaries separating us and them. Where difference binds, similarity divides. Political theorist William Connolly makes much the same point, insisting that, I quote, "there is no identity without difference. To pit the universal against difference," Connolly writes, "reduces the essentially relational character of difference to the bland idea of diversity among independent entities. It is, as I've shown, to reduce the differentiation of becoming to the diversity of being. And to undo this reduction, we must put difference and the universal back together again." In his recent writings, the philosopher Alain Badiou has attempted to do just that. There is only one world, Badiou declares, but it is a world that refuses any normative preconditions for existing in it, such as might be entailed in any naturalistic definition of universal humanity. And this one world, for Badiou, is precisely, and I quote, "precisely the place where an unlimited set of differences exist. Far from casting doubt on the unity of the world, these differences are its principle of existence. It is a world whose oneness is defined not by what everyone or everything has in common, but by their co-participation in a universe of relations." Such a world, however, calls for an alternative politics, of difference rather than similarity, a heteropolitics, in which the community is defined not by an identity of interests set in advance, but by the commitment to getting along together. This is the politics of what Stefano Hani and Fred Moten, the one a theorist of education, the other a literary scholar, call the undercommons. The form of feeling in the undercommons, they say, is, and I quote again, "not collective, not given to decision, not adhering or reattaching to settlement, nation, state, territory, or historical story. It is rather a way of feeling through others, a feel for feeling others feeling you. It is interior sentiment rather than exterior contact, which erupts into the modern constitution as through a fissure, exploding the tidy opposition between the citizen and the state. It is anathema to both. Citizens cannot stand it because it shatters the illusion that each is a free and rational agent. No state can condone it, since it disrupts collective sovereignty. Commoning impels differentiation, but in the eyes of the state, difference can only be expressed in the language of similarity, as though the differentiation were already completed, preordaining the members of this or that culture or subculture to speak with one voice. This is to reduce feeling through others to a marked identity, to revert from the imaginative stretch of commoning to the expression of received characteristics that individuals possess in common from the start. We are back with the opposition of universal reason and cultural diversity, of the one world and the many. If ever we are to break out of it, to give life back to the social, we must appeal to the oneness of a world of infinite and ever-emergent difference. It is the task of anthropology, I believe, to campaign intellectually and politically for the recognition of this kind of world. Thank you very much.